My beloved child, listen closely, because something has been unfolding in conversations you were never present to hear, and the strangest part is not that your name came up, it is the way someone close to your soulmate has been describing you. At first, it sounded almost ordinary. A few people were gathered together, talking casually, when this person suddenly began explaining what you look like. They spoke about the way you carry yourself, the expression people notice when you enter a room, the calmness in your face when you are thinking deeply, and even the little changes in your expression when something genuinely makes you happy. But then somebody interrupted them with a simple question: how do you know all of that? The room became strangely quiet. Because this person was not describing you like someone who had merely seen a picture once. They were describing you with the familiarity of someone who had heard about you again and again. And that is where your soulmate became part of the mystery. Stay with this, because the detail that eventually came out completely changed the meaning of that conversation. Your soulmate had apparently spoken about you far more than anyone realized. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Sometimes it was only a sentence here, a memory there, or a small observation slipped naturally into another conversation. Yet over time, those fragments created such a vivid picture of you that this person felt as though they already understood your presence. Imagine discovering that somebody could recognize the way you smile simply because another person remembered it so clearly. But there was something even more unusual. Every time this person described you, they kept returning to one particular detail. It was not your clothes. It was not your height. It was not your hairstyle. It was something much harder to explain. And when your soulmate finally heard exactly what had been said, even they became silent. Because that one detail revealed that these conversations were never really about your appearance at all. Here is where everything becomes deeper. The person close to your soulmate had apparently told more than one person that there was something unmistakable about your expression, something they could not properly describe with ordinary words. They said that when your soulmate talks about you, they never begin with physical details. Instead, your soulmate describes how different your face looks depending on what you are feeling. They remember the expression you make when you are trying not to laugh. They remember how your eyes seem different when you become serious. They remember the quiet look you carry when your mind is somewhere far away. And suddenly, the people listening understood something surprising. This person knew what you looked like because your soulmate had unintentionally painted a picture of you through memories. Think about that carefully. People usually remember broad details. Hair. Clothing. A photograph. Maybe a smile. But when someone remembers tiny expressions, small reactions, and moments nobody else would consider important, it says something about what their attention was doing in those moments. Your soulmate had been noticing you. Perhaps more closely than they ever admitted. And the person telling everyone what you looked like had picked up on this long before your soulmate realized it themselves. But don't skip what comes next, because somebody listening to the conversation asked another question: why do you always mention that one thing about them? Nobody expected the answer. The person paused before explaining that there was one feature they could never describe accurately because every description your soulmate gave seemed to change depending on the memory. Sometimes your soulmate described it with warmth. Sometimes with wonder. Sometimes with a strange softness in their voice. And that inconsistency became the clue. The detail was not changing because you looked different. It was changing because your soulmate's feelings were changing the way they remembered you. Suddenly, everyone in that conversation stopped thinking about your appearance and started wondering what you actually meant to your soulmate. And then came the moment nobody expected. Someone who had remained quiet through most of the conversation finally said, "I think I know why." Those few words shifted everything. This person had apparently noticed something whenever your soulmate mentioned you. Their posture changed slightly. Their attention became sharper. Even if the conversation moved somewhere else, somehow your name found its way back into their thoughts. That person had seen the pattern before anyone had named it. And now the description of your appearance made sense. Your soulmate was not simply remembering what you looked like, they were remembering moments connected to you. That is the one detail that changes everything. Whenever this person described your eyes, your smile, or your expression, they unknowingly attached a moment to it. That was the expression they had when, that was the way they smiled when, that was the look on their face after. Do you see the difference? A photograph records appearance, but memory records meaning. And apparently, your soulmate had stored meaning around tiny details of you. Stay a little longer, because there is another layer nobody noticed initially. The person close to your soulmate had started telling others about you because they were curious. They wanted to understand why someone who was supposedly just another person in your soulmate's life had become so easy for them to describe. And each time they asked your soulmate another question, they received another small detail. Eventually, they realized they could almost imagine you standing in the room despite barely knowing you themselves. That realization surprised them enough that they started discussing it with others. But there was one thing they deliberately avoided mentioning until now. Something your soulmate had said during one quiet conversation. It was only a short sentence, yet apparently it was the sentence that made this person understand why your image remained so clearly in your soulmate's mind. That sentence was not dramatic. That is exactly why it mattered. Your soulmate had apparently been asked what made you different from everyone else they knew, and instead of immediately answering, they paused. Then they said something unexpectedly simple. There are things about you that people do not notice until they actually pay attention. That was it. But think about what those words quietly reveal. To know that people miss certain things about you, your soulmate first had to notice those things themselves. Suddenly, the entire story changed. The person close to them realized that your soulmate had not been remembering you accidentally. They had been observing qualities that existed beneath the obvious surface. The way your confidence appears even when you say very little. The way your expression becomes softer around people you trust. The way you can appear completely composed while your mind is processing 100 different thoughts. The tiny spark that appears when something genuinely interests you. These were the things your soulmate remembered. And now the person who had been telling everyone what you looked like finally understood why their description sounded so unusual. They were trying to describe something that cannot really be captured by physical features alone, presence. Suddenly, another person in the conversation remembered something important. They had once seen your soulmate looking at a picture connected to you, and instead of commenting on the obvious details, your soulmate had pointed out something incredibly small. Something almost nobody else would have noticed. That memory now carried an entirely different meaning. Because attention is rarely random when it repeatedly returns to the same person. And the biggest revelation was still waiting. The person closest to your soulmate had not started these conversations to gossip about you. They were quietly trying to answer one question for themselves: why does this person matter so much? What they eventually realized surprised even them. The one detail they kept noticing was not actually something about your face, your body, your clothes, or anything visible at all. It was the way your soulmate described you differently from everyone else. When other people were mentioned, the descriptions were simple and quickly forgotten. But when you were mentioned, stories appeared. Moments appeared. Small details appeared. Questions appeared. Even possibilities about the future somehow entered the conversation. And suddenly, the person close to your soulmate understood what had been hiding in plain sight. You had become connected to imagination. Your soulmate was no longer remembering only moments that had already happened. Somewhere inside those conversations, they had started wondering about moments that had not happened yet. What would another conversation with you feel like? What would happen if something unspoken were finally discussed? What would it be like if the distance between uncertainty and understanding finally disappeared? That is why this story changes here. The person telling everyone what you look like eventually stopped describing you altogether. Instead, they looked directly at your soulmate and asked the question that had been building beneath every conversation: have you ever noticed how differently you talk about this person? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And sometimes silence reveals more than a rushed answer ever could. Because in that pause, something became impossible to ignore. Maybe your soulmate had spent so much time wondering what you thought that they never examined what their own memories were revealing. Maybe every tiny detail they remembered had been pointing toward the same realization. And now someone else had finally held up the mirror. The shocking detail was never simply what you looked like. It was how clearly your soulmate could see you when you were not even there. And after that question was asked, your soulmate finally said something they had apparently never said aloud before, something that could completely change what happens between you next. Something shifted immediately after that silence, because your soulmate finally realized the question was not going away. They could change the subject, smile, pretend the conversation meant nothing, or simply walk away, but they could no longer pretend they had never noticed the difference themselves. After a long pause, your soulmate quietly admitted that there was something about you they had never been able to explain properly. Whenever someone asked what you looked like, ordinary descriptions suddenly felt incomplete. They could mention your hair, your expression, your style, or the way you carried yourself, but none of those details seemed to capture the version of you that remained in their memory. And then they said something that surprised the person sitting beside them: it isn't really what they look like. It's what changes when they're there. That sentence completely redirected the conversation. Because now the person close to your soulmate understood why every description of you had sounded different. Your soulmate was not remembering a frozen image. They were remembering your presence inside different moments. They remembered how the atmosphere seemed lighter when you were comfortable, how your expression changed when something caught your attention, and how even your silence could somehow feel meaningful. But wait, because the person listening suddenly connected this confession to something your soulmate had said weeks earlier, something everyone had overlooked at the time. Your soulmate had once casually mentioned that they could probably recognize you in a crowded place without seeing your face clearly. At the time, nobody questioned it. Now someone finally did. How? They asked. Your soulmate hesitated again. And the answer that followed made the mystery even deeper. I think I would recognize the way they move before I recognized anything else. That was when the person close to them realized this was no ordinary memory. But the next discovery was even more unexpected. Someone else who had heard these descriptions before suddenly revealed that they had been keeping track of one strange pattern. Every time your soulmate described you, there was one particular moment they kept returning to without realizing it. Different conversations, different days, different questions, and somehow the same memory kept appearing underneath everything. Nobody knew why that moment mattered so much until now. It was apparently a very simple interaction between you and your soulmate, the kind of moment another person might forget by the following morning. Nothing spectacular happened. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confession, no perfect cinematic scene. You simply looked at your soulmate during a conversation, listened carefully to something they were saying, and responded in a way that made them feel completely understood. That was all. Yet somehow, your soulmate remembered your expression from that moment with incredible clarity. The person close to them finally asked, "Why do you keep remembering that?" Your soulmate could not answer immediately. Perhaps they had never asked themselves. Perhaps the memory had simply lived quietly inside them, appearing whenever your name surfaced. Then came the realization: they remembered your face because they remembered how they felt while looking at it. That was the hidden detail nobody had understood. Your appearance had become connected to an emotion. And once that connection was recognized, every previous conversation suddenly made sense. This person had been telling everyone what you looked like, believing they were describing physical features, while unknowingly repeating clues about your soulmate's emotional memory. Stay with this, because the strangest part happened when someone compared the different descriptions. They noticed that one feature remained consistent every single time, regardless of which memory your soulmate was talking about. And when they pointed it out, your soulmate looked genuinely surprised. The feature was your expression when you were genuinely listening. Not posing. Not trying to impress anyone. Not preparing what you would say next. Simply listening. Your soulmate apparently remembered that expression more clearly than anything else, and the reason was almost impossible for them to explain. Around many people, conversations felt predictable. Someone spoke, someone answered, and life moved forward. But something about the way you listened had made your soulmate feel as though their words actually landed somewhere. That tiny experience had stayed with them. Suddenly, the person close to your soulmate understood why they had been able to describe you to everyone with such strange precision. Your soulmate had unintentionally given them dozens of emotional snapshots. And now another revelation surfaced. The person who had been repeating those descriptions confessed that they had once deliberately changed one detail while talking about you just to see whether your soulmate would notice. They described your expression slightly differently. Your soulmate corrected them immediately. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Almost instinctively. "No," they said, "that's not quite how they look when they do that." Everyone laughed at first, but the person who had made the deliberate mistake did not. They had just received the answer they were looking for. Your soulmate's memory of you was far more detailed than they had admitted. And there was something beautiful hidden inside that realization. The details they protected were not superficial. They were not concerned with whether somebody described your clothing perfectly or remembered every visible feature correctly. What mattered to them was whether people understood the feeling behind your expressions. Somehow, they wanted others to see you the way they had seen you. But why? That question became impossible to avoid. And before your soulmate could answer, the person closest to them revealed something else. There's another reason I've been asking about this. That revelation changed the energy completely. The person explained that they had noticed your soulmate becoming unusually thoughtful whenever conversations about the future appeared. Whenever people talked about where life might take them, who might remain close, or which relationships could become more meaningful with time, your soulmate rarely said your name directly. Yet somehow, details connected to you kept appearing. A place reminded them of something you had said. A song brought back a conversation. Someone's expression reminded them of yours. A future plan suddenly included a possibility that sounded strangely connected to you. Individually, none of these things meant much. Together, they formed a pattern. The person close to your soulmate had started describing you to others partly because they wanted to test something. Would your soulmate lose interest when the conversation moved away from you, or would they naturally bring you back into it? The answer surprised them. Your soulmate never forced your name into conversations, but whenever someone else mentioned you, their attention immediately returned. And then came the most surprising moment yet. Somebody asked your soulmate what they believed you remembered about them. That question caught them completely off guard. Until then, everything had been about what your soulmate noticed in you. Suddenly the mirror turned around. Did you remember their expressions too? Did you remember their little habits? Did certain ordinary moments remain in your mind the way they remained in theirs? Your soulmate became quiet again, but this silence felt different. There was curiosity inside it. For the first time, they were not simply remembering you, they were wondering how you remembered them. And that curiosity opened a door they had apparently kept closed for a long time. Then the person close to your soulmate finally revealed why they had been telling so many people what you looked like. It was never really about making everyone recognize your face. They had been watching your soulmate's reactions. Every description was almost like a small question disguised as conversation. Would your soulmate correct them? Would they add another detail? Would they smile at a particular memory? Would they suddenly become quiet? And each time, the answer became clearer. But there was one final detail this person had not shared with anyone, because they wanted to hear your soulmate explain it first. They leaned closer and said, "There is one expression you always mention, but you never tell us when you saw it." Your soulmate knew immediately what they meant. It was an expression they had described several times without giving the story behind it, a look on your face that seemed peaceful, almost as though for one brief moment you had forgotten everything else around you. Nobody knew where you were, what had happened, or why your soulmate remembered it so clearly. And this time, your soulmate did not change the subject. They finally explained that the moment had happened while you were looking directly at them. Suddenly, every piece fell into place. That was why the description had always sounded different. Your soulmate had not simply been describing what you looked like. Without realizing it, they had been describing what you looked like through their own eyes in a moment that mattered deeply to them. And now that someone else had noticed, your soulmate could no longer hide behind ordinary descriptions. Because the question waiting for them was no longer, what does this person look like? The real question had become, why is this one memory still so clear? And just when everyone thought your soulmate was finally going to answer, they revealed there was another part of that moment nobody knew about, something you had quietly said seconds before that expression appeared.